Labour unions say the latest inflation figures released by the Ghana Statistical Service gives credence to their position that government must increase salaries of workers by the prevailing rate of inflation. Government is currently negotiating public sector pay with organized labour, and inflation figures have become a central pillar for labour in their calls for higher pay. We'll hear from Angel Kagbonu and the TUC shortly, but first, according to government statistician Professor Samuel Kobina Enim, year-on-year inflation for April has hit 23.6%, an 18-year high as against 19.4% recorded in March this year.
CPI for April 2022 was 156.5 relative to 126.6 recorded for the same time in April 2021. The computation of rate of inflation based on these indices, that is 156.5 for the month of April 2022 and 126.6 for the month of April 2021, leads to a year-on-year rate of inflation of 23.6. This literally means that prices of goods and services have gone up by 23.6% over a one-year period, specifically between April 2021 and April 2022. Relative to March 2022, this indicates a 4.2 percentage point inflation rate, higher than the rate that was recorded in March 2022, which stood at 19.4%. This culminates in a first quarter inflation rate of 16.3, which is about 6.2 percentage point what was recorded for the same time in the first quarter of 2021. On a month-on-month basis, that is between March 2022 and April 2022, rate of inflation was 5.1%, and again, this indicates a variation from 4.0 that was recorded on a month-on-month basis for March 2022 relative to April 2022, 5.1%. This is indicating a 1.1 percentage difference. This literally means that on a month-on-month basis, that is between March and April 2022, prices of goods and services have gone up by 5.1%. We do disaggregations at the higher level, specifically the food and non-food inflation, and also from a locally produced items and an imported item perspective. We see that we've sustained the variation between food and non-food inflation for both March and April 2022, which stood at about 5.3%. Specifically, food inflation for April 2022 was 26.6% relative to non-food inflation 21.3%.
Now we can now hear from President of National Association of Graduate Teachers, NAGRAT, Angel Kagbonu, who says life has become unbearable for workers and demand nothing short of the prevailing inflation rate as salary increment.
So, Mr. Kagbonu, these new inflation figures show 23.6%. How will this affect negotiation with government for pay increment for workers?
Well, this is an indication that prices or the change in prices of goods and services is at all-time high. And this this April inflation is the highest in 18 years. An indication that the worker is gradually getting worse off day by day. And like we said from inception, negotiations this year will be influenced by the inflation behavior, as one can put it, because you and I are aware about the proposals made by to PURC, by the water company and the electricity company. You and I are also aware of the escalating prices of transportation announced by the Transport Organization just a fortnight ago. And of course, general price increases of other goods and services. Government's own transaction fees have is gone up.
Now, we'll speak shortly to NAGRAT because Labour is said to make these figures a central plank in their negotiation with government. But my colleague Kweku Asante has been studying the figures and joins me live on Zoom with more. Kweku, what are the drivers for this month's figures? Kweku, kindly on mute so we can hear what you're saying. It looks like your mic is mute.
Yeah, Brace. So if you look at the data that the Ghana Statistical Service have just put out, transport is still very much in the lead, just as it was last month. It's leading with 33.5%. That is very major in terms of the data that has just come out. And so if you look at transport fares having gone up, the recent 20% that has gone up has not yet reflected in these data that has just been given to us. But it takes into consideration a 15% increase in last February to make this adjustment. But the interesting thing about this report is that household equipment, furniture and the likes have just overtaken food as one of the major drivers of inflation. And so look at that, 28.5%, the cost of some of these things in terms of the inflation figures that we have before food and other non-alcoholic beverages coming third. And so transportation is still very much in the lead, with fuel prices going up, with transportation companies increasing lorry fares, and also in terms of home equipment going up. These are the major drivers of this year's inflation figures.
All right, Kweku, I'm grateful to you. Thank you very much. Let's move on and talk to some economists on this particular subject. We've been joined by Dr. Patrick Asuming, who is an economist on Zoom. Doc, good evening and thanks very much for your time. Now, we are just hearing that something like household wares, housewares, like furniture and all of that, have bypassed food. What does this mean?
Good evening and good evening to viewers. So when you look at the release, clearly the inflation has become very entrenched. You notice that the food inflation has been leading the way. It's still overall, the food inflation is still leading the way, but you realize that in particular, imported inflation has jumped up significantly from what we recorded last month. So the inflation has become heavily entrenched, and it's unfortunately look like it's going to stay with us for a while. It's going to remain high for a while before it gets better. So it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Now, Doc, I'll come back to you for us to delve deeper into this. But let me go back to my colleague Kweku Asante and get some figures here. Kweku, if you look at the inflation figures, how does this compare Ghana with its peers in the sub-region? All right, I'll get my colleague later. Let me go back to Dr. Asuming. Doc, so if you look at the inflation figure, we are up from the 19.4. Things are rising. What really, if you look at the price build-up, we have fuel, we have transport, we have food. Why are we having this? Is it because we are not substituting a lot of the importations or what?
So it's a lot of things. I think domestic production has been affected. I think we are witnesses to what happened last year when during the planting season, a lot of farmers started complaining about lack of fertilizers and the fact that the rains were not falling at the time that they were expecting. So, during that period, many economists would have expected that at some point, it is going to feed into the inflation. So we realize that consistently, food inflation has been rising. Mm-hmm. It appears that the recent, fuel prices, when the fuel prices started rising, it takes a while before it will filter into transport prices. So when it started filtering into the first round of increase that we saw was simply because fuel prices were going up. And then maybe private drivers and then transportation of food and other things will be up. But over time, when the transport owners start raising their prices, then that also bring another round of increase. So people might also argue that some of the extra money that was pumped in the economy as a result of COVID, they have been playing a role. But so you see that overall it's a lot of things. Also, we've seen it appears that the Russian Ukraine crisis seems to be playing a role because we've seen that the imported inflation, which has consistently been below the domestic inflation on domestic items, has now shot way up. So a configuration of things, a lot of factors have come into play to ensure that the inflation is really now getting out of hand.
Don't kindly hold the line for me. I'll come back to you. But let my colleague Kweku Asante is back on the line. Kweku, how does this inflation figure compare Ghana with its peers in the sub-region?
So, Brent, if you look at the data, Ghana, we are not doing so well. It supposes that it's much difficult in terms of living standard to be in Ghana than to be elsewhere. If you look at Nigeria, the data suggests that their inflation rate in this comparable period is 15.7%. That is much closer to ours. But if you look at our neighbors in West Africa, look at Ivory Coast, they are performing some magic over there. The inflation rate is 4.5%, as against what we had here of 23.6%. Look at Burkina Faso, they are in the region of Nigeria, 15.1%, whilst Togo, our neighbors Togo, are recording 8.7%. And so the west on the continent is Sudan. The inflation is 260% over there. But that is not the country that Ghana compares themselves with usually. You look at Nigeria, you look at Togo, you look at Burkina Faso, and it seems as though the inflationary figures is overly high around here. And that is why people have raised concerns that the Ukrainian war is on. There are some still international factors. But is Ghana and Ireland, is Ghana the only country feeling this pinch? And these are some of the questions that some economists have been asking.
Kwaku, I'm grateful for that. Let's return to Dr. Esumeh. Doc, if you look at the build-up, now things like furniture have bypassed food. Does it mean that we are buying more of these furnitures than food? That's why the inflation is rising? Or what is accounting for that?
So, fundamentally, it's a pause between the aggregate demand for goods and services and aggregate supply for goods and services. So, generally, if the demand is rising faster, mostly that will be driven by having so much money in the system. If demand is rising faster than the supply available, that will affect the prices. On the other hand, if the production side is also, even if the demand is the same, and the production side is not bringing in as much as before, then you also see prices go up. For what we have, it appears as it's more of the supply side that is driving the inflation we have. So because freights and other things have been, a lot of the, my guess is that a lot of the furniture is imported, even the domestically produced ones, you see that fundamentally cost of production has gone up in the country. So when that happens, it's going to lead to higher prices almost everywhere. So my sense is that it's probably more driven by the supply side.
Well, but this is, the highest in 18 years. There's something fundamentally we are not doing right in terms of managing the economy. What is it?
Well, it's a lot of things. There are some factors that are within our control that we haven't managed very well. And there are some things that, you can say you don't really control. So you talk about external factors. What I find quite not acceptable is especially the food inflation, because for a country like Ghana that has such fertile land for producing all types of different types of food, I think to see food inflation racing away the way it has been is quite alarming. It simply means that what we can do domestically to boost food production, we haven't done that. So there's that part. Obviously, we can't discount the fact that events happening around the globe in terms of the Russia crisis, and it may have played some small role, but yes, those are there, but it also comes to how you manage the consequences. So you see that different countries will manage it different ways. Sometimes what you have done before those crises matters. If, for instance, the investment we had made in domestic production, especially by way of food, and also boosting up our industries, if they were doing well, we would have been in a better position to withstand more of the shocks. So clearly, I think, in particular, the food side, the management of the Planting for Food and Jobs, which is supposed to be our flagship program for addressing food security, it hasn't gone well in the last couple of years. And that is a big explanation for why we are seeing what we are seeing.
But can't it be the reason why, for instance, furniture has bypassed food in terms of the build-up in this inflation rate?
So I think things build up over time. So if you look at people who produce home equipment, home goods and services, there are several things. Sometimes, part of their cost will be transportation, part of their cost will be raw materials like wood, part of their cost might be expenses, but also utility.
Okay.
So all of them, so sometimes they all don't come together at the same time. So, they might be increasing gradually over time, but it appears that now they've all come to a head, and then the combined effect is quite substantial. But, when we think about this, even though, so what we are comparing is food as a group and one particular non-food item. Because the food group taken together accounts for about 43% of the overall CPI basket. It still remains the case that if you compare all the non-food group with the food group, the food is still the biggest driver of the inflation.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Doc. We're grateful that you found time to join us now.